In the history of aviation, there have been numerous cases of hijacking of civilian aircraft. However, only one of these incidents has turned into one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. The criminal did not just escape, he vanished without a trace. No one knows who this man was. 50 years have passed, and we still only have his composite sketch and a fictitious name. You have surely heard this name. Many are even familiar with the details of the story, but that does not make it any less astonishing. November 1971, USA. A man in his 40s, dressed in a business suit, tie, and dark glasses, boards a passenger plane. Shortly after takeoff, he informs the flight attendant that there is a bomb in his briefcase and that the aircraft has been hijacked. The hijacker has several demands, the main ones being parachutes and $200,000 in cash. The plane lands, the criminal's demands are met, and the aircraft takes to the skies again, heading for Mexico. Somewhere along the way, the hijacker takes the bag of money, opens the cabin door, and jumps with a parachute into the night darkness. If this man had been found, alive or dead, within a few days, months, or even years, his story would have remained just a line in the FBI archives, and perhaps would not have even warranted a separate article on Wikipedia. But instead, a large-scale operation to find him was launched, involving intelligence agencies, the military, and the police. The FBI investigated the case for decades, and eventually, amateur internet detectives also joined the search. The number of potential suspects surpassed 1,000, and there were even more possible witnesses. Yet, despite all this, no one has been able to provide a definitive answer to three main questions: how the hijacker organized the operation, where he disappeared after the jump, and finally, who exactly was this mysterious D.B. Cooper? There are stories that possess remarkable quality. The deeper you delve into their details, the more facts and documents you examine, the more convoluted and intriguing they become. The disappearance of D.B. Cooper is one such case. This incident captivates people around the world and has attained a truly cult status in America. Finding D.B. Cooper is almost like discovering Atlantis, meaning it would automatically etch your name into history. Well, let's try to unravel this legend. Let's start with the events on board the plane. Why begin there? Because we know very little about what happened before the hijacking, and even less about what occurred afterward. However, we have a fairly good understanding of what transpired during the flight. Let's focus on this in as much detail as possible. After all, it is the specifics of the flight that will help answer many questions. On November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, one of the major holidays in the USA, boarding was announced for flight number 305 of Northwest Orient Airlines, heading to Seattle. The aircraft, a Boeing 727, was scheduled to depart around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Passengers board through a door at the tail of the plane. This model has the staircase located at the back. The cabin has 18 rows of seats, 3 on each side, but the flight is half empty. There are fewer than 40 passengers on board. One of the last to approach the check-in counter is a man in a black coat and suit holding a briefcase. The flight attendant checking tickets, her name is Florence Schaffner, looks at the ticket and sees the passenger's name, Dan Cooper. The man proceeds to the cabin and takes a seat in the very last row on the right. He places his briefcase on the adjacent empty seat by the window. Across the aisle, in the same last row on the left, sit two passengers. They do not yet know that they will soon become important witnesses. The plane is almost ready for takeoff. Florence Schaffner, the very flight attendant who greeted the passengers, is one of 3 flight attendants on the flight and is responsible for the rear section of the cabin. So far, Dan Cooper does not stand out as suspicious. He is not yet wearing dark glasses, and his formal business suit is a typical appearance for air travelers of that time in the USA. Most people were flying for business. Florence asks Cooper what he would like to drink. He orders bourbon with 7-Up. The plane begins to taxi onto the runway. 2 flight attendants, following protocol, take their seats in the rear of the cabin. The Boeing accelerates. At the moment the aircraft is almost lifting off the ground, Florence turns around at Cooper's signal. He hands her a note. The flight attendant instinctively puts it in her pocket, planning to read it later, but Cooper quietly says, "Miss, you'd better read this now." Florence opens the note and sees the following. "Miss, I have a bomb. Please sit next to me." At first, she asks in confusion if this is a joke. Hearing a calm "no," the flight attendant moves to an empty seat to the left of Cooper. He opens his briefcase. Florence notices red cylinders inside that resemble dynamite, a battery, and a piece of exposed wire in the criminal's hand. Shocked, she passes the threatening note to her colleague, Tina McCoy. Glancing at Florence's face, Tina immediately understands that this is serious. She quickly contacts the pilots via the internal phone. She relays that the plane has been hijacked, the criminal has a bomb, and this is no joke. By this time, the aircraft is already confidently gaining altitude. So, the plane is in the air, and it is important to understand what type of aircraft it is and where it is headed. Let's take a look at the map. Here is the city of Portland on the west coast of the USA, and here is Seattle, quite close by. It's not just a matter of the map's scale. There is indeed a short distance between these cities, and the entire flight takes about half an hour. The flight attendants barely have time to serve drinks and magazines to the passengers. Another important detail is the model of the aircraft. Flight 305 is operated by a Boeing 727. This airliner accommodates over 100 passengers, and they all board through the tail. There is a special door staircase that lowers from the rear of the fuselage. It is operated by a special lever. Usually, flight attendants open and close this staircase, but in theory, anyone could do it. The design with a rear staircase allows the Boeing 727 to land even at very small airports. It can operate without a jet bridge or terminal, and passengers exit directly onto the ground. This was also the case that day. On November 24, 1971, the Boeing 727 had already completed several flights, and the trip from Portland to Seattle was the crew's final one before the long holiday weekend. Upon receiving the message from Florence about the passenger with a bomb, the pilots of Flight 305 relay the information to the dispatcher. For the first few minutes, they are unsure how to proceed, as the hijacker's demands have not yet been stated. However, this uncertainty does not last long. Very soon, Cooper puts on dark glasses. From this moment on, Florence Schaffner will no longer see his eyes, and other witnesses will remember the criminal solely in sunglasses. Cooper asks the flight attendant to write down his conditions. Florence takes notes as he dictates and brings the paper to the cockpit. where the pilots transmit the demands over the radio. The negotiations between the pilots and the dispatch service were almost verbatim documented. The radio communications have been preserved. Here is what Cooper demanded, according to this record. By 5 o'clock in the evening, $200,000 in cash in a bag or backpack must be prepared, along with 4 parachutes, 2 main and 2 reserve. He wants the money in usable American bills, meaning in current U.S. currency. He has a bomb and will use it if his demands are not met. Additionally, Cooper insists that a fuel truck be waiting for the plane upon landing. The aircraft needs to be refueled. He also specifically mentions that food should be prepared for the crew. After that, we will go on a little trip, as the hijacker put it. In conclusion, he warns, no jokes or tricks. By that time, Florence had already left the hijacker and taken the note with the demands to the cockpit. Since Cooper wanted at least one flight attendant to remain by his side, the second flight attendant, Tina McClow, immediately sat down next to him. It is Tina who will spend the most time next to Cooper. Cooper's demands are relayed to ground services, and the FBI is immediately brought into the case. Upon receiving the hijacking report, one of the FBI agents in Portland first assumed that he was dealing with a copycat. Just 10 days prior, a similar incident had occurred in Canada. A passenger on a Canadian flight hijacked the aircraft, threatening to detonate a bomb. He demanded a ransom of $1.5 million, supposedly for the needs of Irish separatists. Ultimately, he agreed to accept only $50,000. That plane also had a rear staircase and a similar design. The hijacker there also intended to jump with a parachute, but was neutralized at the last moment by one of the passengers. This story, of course, made headlines in all the newspapers. Whether Cooper had heard about it or not is unknown, but it is clear that the very idea of hijacking a plane for ransom was already in the air. It was far from being something unique. As I have already noted, the events of the flight are quite well known to us. Not only what happened on board, but also the situation on the ground. The circumstances are fascinating from both sides. On board, Cooper, with a bomb, stated his demands. However, apart from the crew, none of the passengers have any idea that the plane has been hijacked. People in the cabin continue to sit in their seats, unaware. Only one of them, the man who sat in the last row across the aisle from Cooper, later recalled that the situation seemed slightly strange to him. He noticed that the flight attendant spent a long time next to the passenger in dark glasses. Of course, this witness had no knowledge of the bomb or the demands at that time. Meanwhile, on the ground, the FBI and the airline's management are frantically trying to decide how to proceed. They could refuse to meet the hijacker's demands and attempt to storm the plane, but that would put the lives of the passengers at risk. A very recent example comes to mind. Just a month prior, in the fall of 1971, a small plane was hijacked in the Bahamas. At that time, authorities refused to refuel the hijacked aircraft as demanded by the criminal and attempted to apprehend him by force. A shootout ensued, during which some crew members were fatally wounded. Such a tragic experience compelled them to act cautiously. The president of Northwest Orient Airlines makes a decision to urgently prepare $200,000 in cash for delivery to the hijacker in collaboration with the bank. The main task for the authorities is to procure parachutes and arrange for refueling. There is little time, as the flight from Portland to Seattle is very short. And what about the plane? Tina McClaw continues to sit next to Cooper. He, as the young woman notes, is quite polite and calm, not behaving aggressively at all. He smokes cigarette after cigarette and casually asks Tina about herself, who she is, where she's from. Meanwhile, the airliner begins to circle in the sky over Seattle, waiting for the money and parachutes to be prepared on the ground. Looking out the window, Cooper at one point remarks, "Right now we are over a little town not far from here." Most likely, he was referring to Tacoma, a small city near Seattle. Meanwhile, the weather is worsening. Storm clouds are visible from the airplane windows. Due to the forced delay, the pilots come up with a story for the passengers. They announce over the loudspeaker that the plane has a minor technical issue, so they will need to circle above the airport for a while to burn off excess fuel before landing. Of course, hearing this, few are thrilled. Sitting at an altitude of several kilometers above the ground and listening about a technical malfunction is never pleasant. But let's be honest, it's better this way than to learn the truth, that the plane has been hijacked by a man with a bomb. Meanwhile, the FBI on the ground is rushing with all their might. In addition to needing to gather and deliver $200,000 to the airport, agents begin recording the serial numbers of all the bills so that the money can be tracked if it surfaces later. The parachutes were also not easy to obtain. 2 spare parachutes were delivered to the airport late, and they had not yet arrived. Upon learning this, Cooper calmly states that the plane can begin its descent, suggesting that they will land and wait for the spare parachutes on the ground. At one point, Tina asks the hijacker a strange question. Does he harbor any resentment towards Northwest Orient Airlines? To which Cooper replies with a smirk, "Miss, I don't harbor resentment towards your airline, I just harbor resentment." Just like that, without further clarification, just resentment. Later, this phrase will be dissected in detail as people try to understand the true motives of the criminal. We will also revisit it a bit later. Shortly before landing, Cooper becomes noticeably anxious. He feels that the landing is being deliberately delayed because the authorities are preparing a special operation and do not intend to let him go alive. His fears are quite understandable. By this time, Seattle Airport is closed to other flights. There is no one else on the airfield, and snipers are positioned on the rooftops. Even the president of the airline does not know the exact plan of the FBI. After all, the agents might have intended to apprehend the criminal right at the moment of ransom delivery. Finally, as evening approaches, the plane lands in Seattle. FBI agents peer intently through the windows. They can see the heads of passengers sitting in their seats. Cooper is not among them. He is currently in the restroom. The passengers, unaware of the situation, stand up to gather their carry-on luggage. Mobile stairways are rolled up to the front door of the plane. At that moment, Cooper emerges from the restroom. According to the recollections of one of the passengers, he appears to be holding not only a briefcase, but also some kind of bag. What is inside it remains unknown. According to Cooper's conditions, the first people to leave the plane should be those not involved in the hijacking. Tina McClaw descends to the tarmac via the stairs to retrieve the bag with the money. For the FBI, this is the last chance to attempt to neutralize the criminal by force. However, weighing the risks, they decide to adhere to the agreements and refrain from taking any forceful action. Tina returns on board with a heavy bag. Inside are cash bills. She hands it over to Cooper. The hijacker quickly peeks inside. The bag is stuffed with bundles of $20 bills. "Looks plausible," he remarks with satisfaction. After this, Cooper agrees to let the passengers go. Confused, the people descend the stairs onto the dark tarmac. Many still do not fully understand what actually happened in the air. As promised, Cooper also releases the 2 flight attendants. On board with him remain only the pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and flight attendant Tina McClaw. In total, there are 4 crew members. Tina leaves the plane again to bring on board the parachutes. 2 bags with parachutes were delivered literally at the last moment before landing. Upon her return to the cabin, she sees that Cooper is hurriedly giving orders. He asks to close all the window shades so that no one outside can look in. Upon returning to the hijacker, Tina finds him engaged in a strange task. Cooper has taken out a knife and is cutting the straps from one of the reserve parachutes. He is irritated. The money was brought to him in a bag, not in a convenient backpack as he had requested. Therefore, he is now trying to pack the bills into the parachute bag, but it is too small for such a volume of money. Additionally, the refueling of the plane is taking longer than expected, which noticeably frustrates the criminal. Communication between the crew and the hijacker after landing goes through Tina McClaw. It is to her that Cooper dictates his new instructions. They are as follows. "We're flying to Mexico. It can be Mexico City or any other destination as long as it's in Mexico. The altitude should not exceed 10,000 feet, about 3 kilometers. Keep the rear door, the stairs, lowered. Release the landing gear. Lower the flaps to 15 degrees. Turn off the cabin lights. After takeoff, everyone, including the flight attendant, must be in the front part of the aircraft, in the first-class cabin. The curtains separating the first-class cabin must be closed." Cooper also acknowledges that a stop for refueling may be necessary. "You can land anywhere for refueling, but not on U.S. territory," he emphasizes. The hijacker's actions are being closely monitored by analysts on the ground. One of them, a psychiatrist from the Federal Aviation Administration who is consulting with the FBI, is trying to anticipate the criminal's plan. He is convinced that Cooper requested 2 sets of reserve parachutes for a reason. A frightening scenario forms in his mind. The criminal may be planning to take someone from the crew as a hostage, jump with them, and then blow up the plane by throwing a bomb. On the bus, which is meanwhile transporting the passengers of Flight 305 from the airfield to the terminal, a roll call is being conducted. Only one name does not respond: Dan Cooper. This is not surprising to the FBI agents. While the plane was circling in the air, they had already managed to speak with the airline employee who sold tickets for that flight. She recalled a suspicious man in his 40s, with a dark complexion, wearing a black suit and tie, who purchased a ticket and identified himself as Dan Cooper. When the shocked passengers of Flight 305 are brought to the airport building, they are met with chaos. There is hustle and bustle everywhere, with television cameras, reporters, and photographers. Unlike the passengers themselves, the press has long been aware of the hijacked plane and has been eagerly awaiting news. Only upon hearing the persistent questions from journalists, do the people who were on that Boeing finally understand what has really happened. At that moment, amidst the commotion, another curious incident occurs. One of the reporters asks the FBI agents if the name of the suspect is known. The agent replies, "Yes, D. Cooper," pronouncing only the first letter of the first name and the last name. The journalist, not hearing clearly, asks for clarification. D.B. Cooper? And in the chaotic environment, the agent confirms, yes. In that instant, a legend is born. Due to this accidental mistake, most newspapers and news channels will begin referring to the suspect as D.B. Cooper. Under this name, he will enter history even though he actually purchased his ticket as Dan Cooper. Thus, the hijackers' demands are known to the pilots. They analyze them together with the special services and draw initial conclusions. An altitude of about 3 kilometers is indeed relatively low for a commercial airliner. If the aircraft were to ascend higher, the cabin would maintain increased pressure, and an open door would lead to instant decompression. Everything and everyone inside would be sucked out. However, at an altitude of 10,000 feet, just over 3 kilometers, the pressure does not yet require cabin pressurization, meaning the door can be opened without lethal risk for those remaining on board. Clearly, Cooper understood this. However, his knowledge was not sufficient for everything. For instance, he did not take into account that the plane cannot take off with the rear stairs already open. They would have to be opened in mid-air. Additionally, deploying the landing gear and flaps to 15 degrees means a very slow flight, which results in a tremendous fuel consumption. Even with mid-air refueling, it would not be possible to reach Mexico under those conditions. While planning the route, the pilots decided that they would have to land for refueling in Reno, Nevada. Before the new takeoff, the flight attendant hands Cooper the instructions for handling the parachutes, which is which and how to secure them. He simply waves her off. He doesn't need the instructions. Before sending Tina to the front of the plane, Cooper asks her to show him how to open the rear stairs. Tina fulfills his request, after which she inquires about what he plans to do with the bomb. Cooper replies that he will take it with him, either to detonate it or to disarm it before jumping. He then instructs Tina to go to the nose of the aircraft, where the first-class seats are located, and to close the curtain behind her. Tina McCoy notices how Cooper is fiddling with the ropes, trying to tie the heavy bag of money to his body. After that, she draws the curtain, leaving the criminal alone in the empty cabin. The crew prepares for takeoff. The Boeing 727 takes to the skies once again, this time on a night flight, effectively in the opposite direction. What happened on board up until Cooper's jump can only be reconstructed approximately, not with complete certainty. However, we do know in detail what actions the authorities and the crew were taking in parallel. The route of the plane heading to Reno, by the way, passed not far from Portland, the very city from which they originally took off. In other words, the aircraft effectively turned around and headed back in the opposite direction from Seattle. Whether they would reach Reno or not, the pilots were uncertain. Everything depended on Cooper's behavior, his demands, and, not least, the weather. The weather conditions are mediocre. Outside it's dark. The clock shows around 8 p.m. There is light rain, wind at about 5 mph, and low cloud cover. The clouds have descended below a kilometer. Overall, it's not a hurricane, but it's also not a comfortable, clear evening. The FBI decides to send 2 interceptor jets in pursuit of the Boeing, just in case. A couple of helicopters are also dispatched, and shortly afterward, several military aircraft will take off as well. However, a problem quickly arises. The helicopters are too slow. Even the jet airliner flying at minimal speed cannot be caught. The fighters, on the other hand, are too fast. They have to patrol at high altitude and frequently lose sight of the captured aircraft on radar because they cannot circle around it either. The fighter pilots are left with no choice but to cruise back and forth along the presumed route. It is important to understand the main objective of these military aircraft is not to apprehend Cooper. The fighters were deployed to shoot down the Boeing if, for any reason, the pilots lose control and the aircraft heads toward residential areas. If such a risk arises, destroy the plane in the air to prevent it from crashing into the city. About 20 kilometers after leaving Seattle, the pilots of the aircraft notice a signal on the instrument panel. The light indicating that the rear stair door is lowered has illuminated. At that very moment, a hellish roar erupts in the passenger cabin. Cold wind rushes in with tremendous force. Everything around vibrates and howls like in a tornado. The pilots cannot see the temperature inside the cabin, but the outside sensors indicate around 7 degrees. The pilots attempt to communicate with Cooper through the internal intercom. They ask if he needs assistance, to which he replies, "No, everything is fine." After a while, they notice a sharp drop in cabin pressure and light turbulence. The plane noticeably jolted. Whether this was related to the hijacker jumping was difficult to determine at that moment. The pilots try to reach Cooper again. This time, there is silence. The crew needs to inform the hijacker that they are preparing to land. Fuel is low, and it's time to descend for refueling. They need Cooper to close the rear stair door, otherwise the structure will be damaged upon landing. The door will simply be swept away upon touching the runway, damaging the tail of the aircraft and preventing it from going far. But Cooper does not respond. At 10:15 p.m. local time, the Boeing 727 lands at Reno Airport. The rear stair door remains deployed, scraping along the runway and sending showers of sparks flying as it drags across the concrete. The aircraft comes to a stop. The captain exits the cockpit, walks through the curtained first-class cabin, and slightly opens the curtain. There is no one behind. The stair door is wide open. D.B. Cooper has vanished into the night. Interestingly, in one of the news broadcasts that aired immediately after the incident, the announcer refers to the hijacker as Dan Cooper. Most journalists, as we know, would mistakenly say D.B. Cooper, but some initially reported it correctly. However, this no longer mattered. The legend of the elusive D.B. Cooper began to take on a life of its own. Dan Cooper, also known as D.B. Cooper, literally became a myth in just a matter of hours. After flight attendant Tina Mucklow left the criminal alone in the tail of the flying aircraft, no one ever saw him again, neither alive nor dead. Moreover, to this day, no one has been able to establish his true identity. Could Cooper have survived jumping out with a parachute under such conditions? If not, why was no body, parachute, or money ever found? If he did survive, how was he able to remain hidden for half a century? There are many questions. Let's try to sort them out in order. The next day, November 25th, 1971, a large-scale search operation begins. According to various reports, between several hundred to 1,000 people participate. Police officers, military personnel, and FBI agents. Aircraft and helicopters scour the area from the air. Boats inspect the bodies of water, and ground teams coordinate their efforts. Searching for Cooper along the entire route from Seattle to Reno is a clearly doomed endeavor. It is a vast distance, and no amount of human resources will suffice. Therefore, investigators set themselves a new task: to determine the exact time of Cooper's jump, down to the minute. In a typical criminal case, such precision is not necessary. But here, it involves a jetliner that can cover several kilometers in a minute, even at its slowest speed. If they are mistaken about the timing, the search will go completely off course. According to the readings from the Boeing 727 instruments, the rear door opened at 7:42 p.m. Then, at 8:12 p.m., there was the sudden drop in pressure and jolt of the aircraft. Could this moment correspond to Cooper's jump? To figure this out, we will need to apply a bit of physics and mathematics. What was Cooper's weight and the total weight of the cargo he left the plane with? According to witness accounts, the hijacker was over 110 meters tall, with an average build. Not a skinny guy, but not overweight either. Let's assume Cooper's mass was around 80 kilos. Next, the money. The entire sum was given in $20 bills. Simple arithmetic. $200,000 amounts to 10,000 banknotes. They were bundled in packs of 100, resulting in 100 bundles. As you can imagine, the bag of money was quite large and heavy, around 10 kilos. The parachute with a harness weighs approximately the same. Thus, about 100 kilograms of weight was falling from the plane. Due to the strong airflow, the rear stair door likely did not fully descend during the flight. It was being buffeted by the wind along with the person preparing to jump. Would an amateur take such a step? Unlikely. The situation is extremely risky. Nevertheless, engineers from Northwest Orient Airlines concluded that Cooper's jump could have caused the drop in pressure and the vibrations of the aircraft around 8:12 p.m., give or take a couple of minutes. Based on this timing and knowing the speed of the plane and its course, the FBI estimates where Cooper might have landed. This results in a search area of over 100 square kilometers. That is still a very large area. With the help of a computing center, essentially computers that were a rarity at the time, this area is narrowed down to 60 square kilometers. Once again, let's turn to the map. According to the FBI, Cooper's jump and fall occurred in this area just a few dozen kilometers short of Portland, where the hijacker originally boarded the plane. The theory that the criminal landed precisely here will later be challenged by some independent researchers. They will have their own evidence and theories. However, both then, in 1971, and to this day, the official position of the FBI remains: Cooper jumped roughly over this section. Part of this territory consists of dense, difficult-to-navigate forests. By the end of November, there is usually already snow on the ground, and overall, the weather is miserable. All of this greatly complicates the search efforts. In addition to hundreds of law enforcement officials, Cooper was also searched for by enthusiastic volunteers. Many of them were primarily hoping to find not the hijacker himself, but the $200,000. However, by that time, authorities had already published lists of serial numbers for all the bills. Spending that money would have been nearly impossible, as it would have been tracked immediately. Instead, one could receive a reward of $25,000 from the airline for assistance in capturing the criminal or discovering the money. To give you an idea of the amounts involved, in today's terms, $200,000 is over $1 million, and the promised reward is roughly 1/10 of that amount. So, about $100,000 at current prices. Quite a substantial sum. Naturally, authorities wanted to find Cooper as quickly as possible for two reasons. First, winter was approaching, and the search would likely have to be suspended for several months due to weather conditions. Second, the longer this story dragged on, the greater the risk of copycats emerging. The story was widely discussed in the press, and many were impressed by it. Surely, there would be those eager to replicate something similar. Spoiler, indeed, such individuals would emerge. Alongside the ground searches, the FBI is working with evidence and witnesses. The main task in working with witnesses is to describe Cooper's appearance in as much detail as possible so that artists can create his portrait. As is known, eyewitness accounts are unreliable and subjective. The first composite sketch of Cooper, based on the description of one of the passengers, turned out to be very vague. Such a description could potentially apply to hundreds of thousands of people. The situation was further complicated by the fact that witness testimonies often varied significantly. Some passengers believed the hijacker was around 35 years old, while others were convinced he was over 50. The main problem was that all the witnesses saw Cooper wearing dark sunglasses, with the exception of one flight attendant. The exceptional witness was Florence Schaffner, the very one who first received a note from Cooper and sat next to him for a while until he put on dark sunglasses. Her testimony, along with the words of her colleague Tina McCoy, formed the basis for the most famous composite sketch of Cooper, the with glasses and without glasses versions. According to Florence's recollections, Cooper had dark brown eyes and dark hair. His age was approximately 40-45 years. His height was just over 100 centimeters. His suit and shoes were black. Tina McCoy generally confirmed this information with slight adjustments. In her opinion, the hijacker's height was a bit shorter, around 180 centimeters or slightly less, and his shoes were brown. In any case, a relatively coherent portrait of the criminal was finally created. Another aspect of the FBI's work involves physical evidence. Immediately after landing in Reno, agents boarded the plane and conducted a thorough search. The first and most obvious finding was fingerprints. Everywhere Cooper could have touched, dust was sprinkled with a special powder. The armrests of the seats, the bathroom door, the telephone receiver he used to communicate with the crew. As a result, a whole kaleidoscope of fingerprints was discovered. However, this was of little use. They collected an entire array of fingerprints. But which ones belonged to Cooper and which were left by the crew, other passengers on this flight, or even passengers from previous flights on the same plane? It was completely unclear. The next important piece of evidence was the cigarette butts. In 1971, smoking was allowed in airplane cabins, and Cooper took full advantage of this. He reportedly smoked around 8 cigarettes during the flight. The butts were found in the ashtray built into the armrest of the seat. It seemed like a stroke of luck. Each butt had saliva on it, which meant a DNA sample of the criminal. The case was practically solved. Unfortunately, reality is not that simple. First of all, this was the 1970s. DNA analysis was not yet an available tool in forensics. It would take a couple of decades before genetic testing became routine. In the early 70s, the butts were considered merely circumstantial evidence. They confirmed that the hijacker smoked, but not a key to his identity. Moreover, as it later turned out, the FBI simply lost these valuable cigarette butts. After inspecting the plane, they were sent to one of the Bureau's regional offices, and there, the traces vanished. Years later, when DNA analysis technology became available, it turned out that there was essentially nowhere to look for Cooper's samples. Among all the evidence collected from the plane, it was precisely the cigarette butts that had gone missing. Nevertheless, immediately after landing, experts collected other important physical evidence at the scene. A couple of hairs were found on the seat where Cooper had been sitting. One of them was a brown hair from a person's head. Analysis showed that it belonged to someone of Caucasian descent, i.e. white. It was impossible to determine whose hair it was, but it was unlikely to belong to any of the crew members. Nearby on the floor lay a narrow black tie with a gold clip, a standard inexpensive clip-on tie, which does not tie but fastens. Did this tie belong to Cooper? Most likely. Men rarely lose their ties, especially those with clips. Apparently, in the chaos of getting rid of excess items, the hijacker simply forgot or discarded it. However, there could be no absolute certainty that the tie was indeed his. Nonetheless, the FBI included this item as evidence. And of course, we need to talk about the parachutes. Cooper demanded 4 parachutes. It is clear that he did not take all 4 with him, meaning that some of the equipment was left on board. Parachutes are a separate chapter in this story because they can reveal a lot. Firstly, by examining which parachutes Cooper took with him, one can gauge his skills and level of preparation. Secondly, knowing the specifications of the parachutes and the conditions of the jump allows for an approximate assessment of whether he had any chance of survival at all. I had never jumped with a parachute and knew little about them, but during the preparation of this story, I learned quite a bit. Let's start with the basics. The main parachute is attached to the back, while the reserve parachute is in front on the chest. Cooper was given 2 sets, 2 main parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. The parachutes were assembled in a hurry, with one specialist working on the main ones and another on the reserves. An important detail: the 2 main parachutes turned out to be different models, designed for different purposes. They differed much like a passenger car differs from a tank. One was a civilian parachute intended for sport jumps, fairly comfortable, maneuverable, allowing for relatively soft landings and precise control over descent direction. The other was an old-style military parachute, less comfortable, less controllable, designed more for reliability than for a gentle landing. Which parachute did Cooper jump with? The second one, meaning the military one. This choice immediately suggests that the hijacker might have had military experience. Perhaps He served in the Army and chose a familiar model that he had jumped with before. The military theory is indirectly supported by the fact that Cooper, even at the ticket purchasing stage, inquired with the airline employee about which model of airplane would be on the flight. "Will it be a Boeing 727?" he asked. Why did he need to know this? The thing is, the Boeing 727 was widely used for CIA covert operations precisely because of its rear ramp. In the 1960s, American military personnel literally dropped people or cargo from the back of a 727, opening the rear door mid-flight. Cooper might have been familiar with such operations. This is yet another hint that our mysterious hijacker may have had connections to the military or intelligence services. The theory is appealing. A paratrooper familiar with CIA planes planned to use their own tactics. However, not everything is so straightforward. At least, the reserve parachutes do not fit well into this theory. The instructor who prepared the parachute equipment for Cooper later confessed to the FBI that he mistakenly grabbed one completely unusable reserve parachute in a hurry, a dummy for training that does not deploy. And guess which set Cooper jumped with? He chose exactly that reserve parachute, which was essentially a prop. As for the normal reserve parachute that remained on board, he simply cut off a few straps, presumably the very lines he needed to tie the money bag to himself. A reasonable question arises. How could a professional not notice the catch, not realize that the reserve parachute was a training dummy stuffed with white threads? It is unclear. This is yet another detail that undermines the theory of Cooper as a cold-blooded super expert. Additionally, it turned out that Cooper did not know how to open the rear door of the Boeing. He had to ask the flight attendant about it. One would agree that an airline employee or an experienced military person who worked with the 727 would know such things. This fact raises the question: could Cooper have successfully jumped and survived if he decided to make the jump at night, in far from ideal weather, with a military main parachute and a non-functional reserve? The FBI consulted with parachute experts. One of the specialists confidently stated that survival was quite possible if the main parachute functioned properly. Moreover, the hijacker did not need to be an exceptional special forces operative. Having at least 7 to 8 jumps under his belt would have been sufficient to handle such a situation. The issue, however, was that the landing was likely to be rough, as it is difficult to gauge the moment of touchdown at night. According to the expert, Cooper could have sustained injuries upon landing, for example, injuring his legs. Having gathered all the information about the parachutes, the FBI checked hospitals in the area of the presumed landing to see if anyone had sought treatment for fractures or other injuries typical of a failed parachute jump. They found no suitable cases. The agents also decided to investigate individuals from intelligence and military services who had participated in covert operations using the Boeing 727. Perhaps someone among them matched Cooper's description. Again, there was nothing. Neither among former military personnel nor among active CIA employees could they identify anyone resembling our mysterious hijacker. The FBI's main efforts in the early days of the investigation were focused on the area of the presumed jump, specifically in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, the states of Washington and Oregon. Firstly, It is highly likely that Cooper was well acquainted with this region. After all, he boarded the plane in Portland and recognized the city of Tacoma through the window, indicating that he was familiar with the geography of the area. Jumping in familiar territory is safer. Secondly, investigators hope to find any witnesses, people who might have seen Cooper before the jump or after his landing. FBI agents embarked on lengthy rounds, visiting homes and offices, to speak with everyone who could theoretically have seen the suspicious stranger on November 24th. They brought in hundreds of suspects, individuals fitting Cooper's description, to ask them additional questions. A few days after the incident, the FBI sent out a composite sketch of Cooper to the newspapers. The list of possible suspects began to grow rapidly. A wide range of citizens fell under suspicion: police officers, former convicts, military personnel, factory workers, security guards, amateur parachutists, and professional skydivers. In short, anyone who could theoretically know something about airplanes and jumps. The likelihood that the criminal used his real name when purchasing the ticket was close to zero. Nevertheless, investigators took the time to check some individuals with the last name Cooper, who matched the descriptions. And of course, a flood of messages came in from citizens, neighbors, colleagues, comrades, friends, and relatives. People from all over the country wrote in, claiming that they personally knew the hijacker and were ready to tell the FBI the whole truth. The Bureau even made several arrests based on hot tips, but it quickly became clear that these individuals had no connection to the case. Weeks go by, and there are no results. No sign of Cooper, no money, no parachutes, and no credible witnesses. However, strange side events begin to occur. Letters start arriving at newspaper offices. One, another, a third, from different parts of the country, mostly on the West Coast. Some are handwritten, others typed, and some are even composed of cut-out letters and words glued onto paper. The content is similar. The sender claims to be the very Dan Cooper and states that he managed to escape. The FBI, as well as most journalists, consider all these letters to be hoaxes. The Bureau is convinced that they are just someone's silly pranks amidst the commotion. There is no evidence that any of these messages were written by the hijacker. Nevertheless, some of the letters are quite interesting in their content. We will return to these messages later. For now, one point is important. In several letters, the author emphasizes that he does not consider himself a modern-day Robin Hood. Why did he write this? The fact is that, strangely enough, many Americans began to perceive Cooper in such a romantic light in the early 1970s. Yes, he did not give the stolen money to the poor, but, to put it figuratively, it was as if he had spited the system. And he did this at the risk of his life. On the West Coast of the United States, Cooper instantly became a celebrity. Songs were written about him, and themed parties were held. In people's minds, he appeared somewhat like this: a guy who took a risk, didn't kill or injure anyone, and vanished with $200,000 in cash. Quite audacious. It reached the point of absurdity. Some referred to D.B. Cooper as a hero. Moreover, even some law enforcement officials felt sympathy for him. Rumors circulated that certain police officers and agents secretly hoped that Cooper would never be caught. D.B. Cooper ultimately became a legend, I mention this peculiar heroization for a reason. It helps to understand the cultural context, which in turn can illuminate not only the reasons, but also the motives behind what happened. What did Cooper mean when he said he was just feeling angry? What drove him to take such a step? And how did it happen that a man with a bomb calmly boarded a plane, purchasing a ticket without any passport or identification? There are many questions, but the answer is one. Because in the 1960s and early 1970s, everything was different, including civil aviation. Airlines still do everything to ensure we feel comfortable on board. But in the 1960s, when commercial flights were just gaining popularity, they tried even harder. Marketers wanted people to forget the simple fact that a huge metal machine was somehow flying 10 kilometers above the ground while they sat inside, having no influence over the situation. To keep passengers as calm as possible, they provided maximum comfort. In the 1960s, traveling by plane resembled more of a trip to an upscale restaurant. Passengers were served exquisite dishes during the flight. Smoking was allowed right in the cabin. The flight attendants' uniforms often resembled outfits worn by runway models. The girls were expected to look impeccable, strictly monitor their weight, and overall embody the image of charming, welcoming hostesses of the airborne home, ready to fulfill any passenger's request at the first call. And what about safety at airports? In short, it was almost non-existent. There were no metal detectors, no mandatory screenings. You could buy a ticket for a flight without presenting either a passport or any documents. No one wanted to scare away potential customers with unnecessary fuss. This all continued even though a real epidemic of airplane hijackings had already begun in the United States. Just think about it. 130 hijackings occurred in America between 1968 and 1972. Not over the course of history or in half a century, but in less than 5 years. 130 cases. There were days when 2 or 3 planes were hijacked at once. Very often, hijackers demanded to fly to Cuba. Since the early 1960s, there had been no direct flights between the United States and the Island of Freedom. So the hijackers came up with ways to get there. Some of them were Cubans wanting to return to their homeland. Others were idealists who sympathized with Fidel Castro and dreamed of seeing him. Gradually, criminals realized that they could fly not just to Cuba. They could, for example, force pilots to direct the plane anywhere, even to Argentina, while simultaneously demanding a ransom. This wave of hijackings for the purpose of obtaining money began precisely in the early 1970s. And yet, despite all these incidents, airlines and authorities were slow to implement the strict security measures we are accustomed to today. By the end of 1971, when D.B. Cooper's hijacking occurred, the only new measures that had been introduced were selective screenings of suspicious passengers and the presence of an air marshal, a plainclothes law enforcement officer flying incognito and tasked with ensuring safety on board. On some flights, far from all. No one screened Cooper before the flight. Apparently, he did not raise any alarm. Moreover, there was no air marshal on that flight. A comprehensive, total screening of luggage and all passengers at boarding was only introduced in the United States 2 years later, in 1973. Was Cooper's case the starting point? Not exactly, but it certainly became one of the factors that influenced the tightening of regulations. In the same year of 1972, several more audacious airplane hijackings occurred in the States, leading to a breaking point for authorities, and aviation security changed forever. Continuing the discussion about the historical context, it is worth noting another detail. The late 1960s and early 1970s in the United States were marked not only by the Vietnam War, but also by serious economic problems. The country was experiencing a wave of mass layoffs, and the record holder for job cuts was, ta-da, Boeing. Yes, that very aerospace giant that produced the Boeing 727. The highest number of layoffs occurred in Seattle and its suburbs, where Boeing's factories were located. It was to that region that Cooper was originally headed, and it seemed he recognized the landscapes there. Therefore, investigators couldn't help but wonder, could our hijacker be a former Boeing employee who had been laid off and was angry at the world? The theory sounded logical, and the FBI thoroughly investigated former employees of the aerospace company. However, they found no suitable candidates. Moreover, the very fact that Cooper inquired about the model of the plane before the flight does not necessarily indicate an industry worker. Any avid traveler can distinguish a Boeing 727 from, say, a Boeing 707. And as we already know, the hijacker did not know how to open the door of the 727. It is unlikely that such a gap would exist for a former Boeing engineer or pilot. Therefore, the theory of the disgruntled factory employee found no supporting evidence. Now, it is time to talk about the suspects, more specifically about those who at various times were seriously considered the most likely candidates for the role of D.B. Cooper. As mentioned earlier, the total number of people investigated in the case reached nearly 1,000. However, let us focus on just a few individuals, those who frequently come up in discussions more than others. Suspect number 1, Richard McCoy. In April 1972, less than 6 months after Cooper's jump, a new airplane hijacking occurred, remarkably similar to Cooper's story. A man identifying himself as James Johnson boarded a flight to Los Angeles. He was wearing glasses and carrying a briefcase. He claimed that there was explosives in the case, and in addition, he displayed a grenade and a pistol. The demands were familiar: 4 parachutes and $500,000 in cash. The plane, yes, once again, a Boeing 727. The hijacker, like Cooper, ordered the rear stairway to be opened during the flight and jumped out at night with the money. This time, the criminal's operation also initially went smoothly. He successfully landed, hid the parachute and money in a secluded spot, in a ditch, planning to return for them later. Then he calmly made his way home. 2 days later, as if nothing had happened, he prepared to go to work. It was then that FBI agents apprehended him. It turned out that the alias James Johnson concealed the hijacker's real name, Richard McCoy. During a search, they found almost all of the stolen money. Only about $30 was missing, and the parachute. McCoy jumped not far from home in the state of Utah. Under local laws, hijacking an airplane with aggravating circumstances was punishable by death, meaning McCoy faced, no less and no more, the death penalty by firing squad. Some FBI agents were convinced that McCoy was Cooper. According to their theory, the criminal decided to repeat the trick because he wanted to earn more, since the first time went successfully, or because for some reason he had lost the initial money. For instance, he might have dropped it during the jump. McCoy himself categorically denied any connection to Cooper's case. Moreover, he did not even admit his guilt in the very hijacking after which nearly $500,000 in cash was found at his home. Quite a stubborn individual. Be that as it may, it can be said that McCoy was lucky. His death sentence was commuted to 45 years in prison for the hijacking of the Boeing in 1972. The investigation was unable to find direct evidence linking him to Cooper's case. Over the next few years, Richard McCoy managed to escape from prison a couple of times. During one of the escapes, he was shot by police. This is how his story ended. Nevertheless, Richard McCoy remains one of the main candidates, in the top 5 or top 6, for the role of D.B. Cooper to this day. For instance, one of the FBI agents who continued to work on the Cooper case in the early 2000s was firmly convinced that McCoy was indeed Cooper. The arguments in favor of this theory were quite compelling. Firstly, the hijacking operation carried out by McCoy was very similar to Cooper's. The same type of aircraft, the same demands, parachutes and money, the same method of delivering notes with threats and requests. McCoy escaped in exactly the same way, through the rear door with a parachute and with the money. Secondly, McCoy, like the hypothetical Cooper, used disguises. He wore a wig and makeup, and he traveled under a false name. It is quite possible that Cooper did the same. Thirdly, McCoy's biography fits the profile of